Madam President of the Parliamentary Assembly, Excellencies, dear members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, ladies and gentlemen, it's really for me an honor to address you at the opening of this parliamentary year. And I would like also, if you allow me, Madam President, to start by congratulating you for your election. Dear Petra, you bring long experience to this role. You take on this responsibility at a decisive time for Europe, and I look forward to working closely with you in the months and years ahead.
Thank you so much.
And I also want to take this occasion to warmly thank the outgoing President, Theodoros Rousopoulos, for the very good collaboration we had in the last years and for his very strong commitment to the Council of Europe and to our shared values. Excellencies, dear members of the Parliamentary Assembly, I stood before this Assembly for the first time 16 months ago. It was in September 2024, just days after taking office. And that same week, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, Venezuela's foreign minister said it was time to rescue the founding principles of the UN Charter. At the same time, in Brussels, the outgoing NATO Secretary General insisted that the alliance was strong, united, and more important than ever. In the United States, a presidential candidate said he had a very good relationship with both President Zelensky and President Putin and promised to end the war in Ukraine very quickly. After the first and only presidential debate, he was trailing in the polls. And in Greenland, the headlines were about a landslide that triggered a tsunami in a remote fjord. That was the world we thought we knew. So, why are we acting surprised? This rupture did not come out of nowhere. Firstly, after the Cold War, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for the assurance that its sovereignty and borders would be respected, and that force would not be used against it. And by the time Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that assurance was broken. Not once, but twice. Secondly, I want to mention the financial crisis of 2008, which exposed years of greed and speculation. Jobs disappeared, public debt exploded, and it was people, not the banks, who paid the price everywhere. Accountability stopped with those too big to fail. Thirdly, I can mention the COVID-19 pandemics that also led us to where we are today. In the first weeks of the pandemic, flights stopped and borders closed. Governments competed for masks and for vaccines. As fear spread, misinformation filled the gaps. Just add to this climate change, multilateralism on life support, and the return of certain forms of populism thought long gone. And we entered what I called the perfect storm. This can give the illusion that we are witnessing something entirely new, but we are not. What is new? What is really new in this situation is the acceleration of crisis. It comes with a constant flow of information. It comes with the volatility it creates. By now, the patterns are clear. Positions change within days, if not hours. Threats are made only to be reversed. A so-called board of peace is announced in an attempt to sideline the United Nations. Now we are not naive. Power politics have always existed. What is troubling is where they are appearing, within alliances and not outside. Inside spaces built on law, consent and predictability. And that is why we are speaking of a rupture in the world order. We are at a turning point in understanding world power and Europe's role in it. And today, that struggle is framed in terms of security, from national security to energy security, border security, and cyber security. It is invoked to justify decisions abroad and to reshape politics at home. As we see in Greenland, it reaches even questions of territory. Europe is told that insisting on international law is naive in an age of hard power, that rules must bend for security. But just look at where this leads. We are hearing threats of military action over territory of a member state. Once security becomes the overriding logic, everything else becomes negotiable, including sovereignty. And international law remains the last common language capable of restraining power in a fragmenting world. Institutions dedicated to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are no longer at the margins of security debates. They are now Europe's center of gravity. And the Council of Europe, our institution, was exactly built for this. Europe does not need to choose between law and security. That is a false choice. Law is Europe's form of power. Law creates autonomy without domination. It creates cooperation without submission, and security without surrender. This is exactly what we mean by democratic security. Charles Dickens wrote A Tale of Two Cities at a moment when an old order was breaking and no one knew what would replace it. And Europe is facing once again two possible worlds. One where security is reduced to force and sovereignty becomes negotiable. And one where security is built on rights, on institutions, on law. And what will happen next? What happens next depends on the choices we make and the choices we make now. And there are mistakes we cannot afford. First, we cannot let competing crises pull us off course. Ukraine risks being pushed into this background as a crisis compete for attention. That would be a serious mistake. This war has not paused. Strikes on infrastructure are leaving people without heat in sub-zero temperatures. And its outcome will shape Europe's future for decades to come. Secondly, international law is not dead. The Council of Europe was founded on the idea that law, not raw power, must guarantee the dignity and rights of individuals and the sovereign equality of states. And Europe must act to protect its legal framework, and the Council of Europe is ready to play its part. If we fail in Europe to articulate a legal and political vision, others will fill the vacuum, shifting security from law to strategic leverage. And finally, middle powers are not powerless. Principles without power are fragile, but power without principles is really dangerous. And the space between great powers is not empty. It is where Europe must act. In Greenland or crises like Venezuela, This moment cannot be reduced to a binary choice between sterile condemnation and blind support. In both cases, we abdicate our own responsibility. Europe's task is different and must be different. To refuse a world governed by exceptions, to refuse a world governed by double standards or competing spheres of influence. And to insist that security cannot be built by bargaining away the principles, the very principles that sustain it. You know, as Maia Sandu, the President of Moldova, told us before, the Council of Europe was not created for moments of comfort. It was exactly created for moments like what we are witnessing right now, when the rules of the old order are no longer assumed, even among those who wrote them. What other organization in Europe exists to confront exactly this question? Not as a military actor, not as a market, but as a legal community of 46, bound by commitments that cannot be rewritten in crisis. And I think that gives us a particular responsibility, and we are exactly acting on it. When Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine, we did not abandon law in the name of force. The opposite, we built accountability where none existed before. As you know, the register of damage is operational. In last December, states signed a convention establishing the International Claims Commission, and last week we launched the advanced team for the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression. And when the fighting stops, the Council of Europe will still be there. 4 institutions, 4 elections, 4 democratic recovery. I can also mention migration. On migration, Europe is also told there are only 2 options: to abandon legal constraints in the name of control, or to defend principles while ignoring legitimate pressures. And this is another false choice. On the road to Chisinau, ministers are working within the European Convention on human rights to ensure that security and legality move together. And the third element, information. Information itself had become a security issue. Polarization is engineered, is amplified by platforms, by generative AI, and by foreign interferences. And that is why the Council of Europe is working on a new convention on disinformation and foreign interference. Not to police speech, but to protect democratic choice. So no democracy is left to face this alone. Sometimes Europe is told that it is weak, that its values are outdated, that history is passing it by. I think the danger is not only that others say this. The danger is that we begin to believe it ourselves. We face temptations as dangerous as the threats. One is sentimentality. Sentimentality to speak eloquently of values, to issue solemn declarations, and quietly accept irrelevance. Another is atrophy, to hold on to old structures even as they stop working, and to mistake continuity for strength. Neither will protect us. Another way is possible, and it is already taking shape in Ukraine by building accountability that will outlast the war. On migration, as I just mentioned before, by refusing to surrender our legal standards in the name of control. On disinformation, by defending democratic debates before it is captured or manipulated. In every place where democratic choice is under pressure. I think the deepest rupture today is not just geopolitical. it is democratic. And in the coming month, we will announce the next stage of our work with democratic security as our continent's answer to the emerging world order. Europe does not need a kind of me-first politics. Europe needs something different. Democracy first. Rule of law first. And human rights first. Thank you for your attention.